There is a name carved above the entrance of nearly every church built in the Western world for the last 500 years. Not the name of the denomination, not the name of the founder, a title, a description of who lives inside. And scholars have known for decades that the translation printed on those walls is not just incomplete, it is structurally inverted from what the original language says. The word is Lord. And before you close this tab because you are certain you already know what that means, give me the next few minutes. Because what the Hebrew underneath that word reveals is not a title at all. It is a name that was considered so alive, so dense with presence, that ancient scribes would stop, wash their hands, pick up a new pen, write it, and then wash their hands again before continuing. A name so loaded with meaning that the religious establishment made a collective decision to hide it behind a word that means something almost entirely opposite. That decision shaped everything. It shaped how you pray. It shaped what you expect when you pray. And it shaped the distance you feel, or don't feel, when you speak to the God you're addressing. Most of us received the following understanding. God has a title, Lord, which communicates authority, hierarchy, and the demand for obedience. He sits above. We address him from below. The relationship is vertical, formal, and fundamentally defined by the gap between his power and our dependence. You call him Lord because that is what he is, and you are not. That frame is ancient, it is familiar, and it contains just enough truth to make the distortion inside it invisible.
Here is the fissure. In the original Hebrew text, not the Greek translation, not the Latin, not the King James, the word that appears in the most sacred formulas of Israelite worship, the word that appears over 6,000 times in the Hebrew scriptures, is not a title, it is a name. 4 specific letters, a name so particular that it was given to no one else in the ancient Near East, a name that carries inside its own grammar a revelation about the nature of the one who holds it that no title ever could. The name is the Tetragrammaton, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. 4 letters that religious tradition has rendered as Lord in small capitals in most English Bibles, a typographic convention that signals to the reader, we are not going to say this name out loud, and we are not going to show you what it actually contains. We are giving you a substitute. The substitute is not wrong exactly, but it is a placeholder that gestures toward authority while concealing the actual content of the name. And the actual content, once you see it, does not point toward authority at all. It points toward something the ancient world had no category for. Let's go into the letters. The Yod is the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In its ancient Proto-Sinaitic form, it was drawn as a hand, specifically an open hand extended outward. Not a fist, not a pointing finger, an open hand in the posture of giving, of releasing, of offering something to another. The most compact visual symbol in the ancient Semitic world for agency expressed through generosity. When Hebraic scholars trace the semantic field of the Yod, they find it clustering consistently around ideas of active reaching, the dynamic forward motion of intention meeting reality.
The He is the 5th letter. Its ancient pictographic root is a figure with arms raised. Some traditions read this as a person calling out, others as someone receiving something from above, arms open. The letter appears twice in the Tetragrammaton, at the 2nd position and the 4th, and that repetition is not decorative. In Hebrew structural grammar, repetition intensifies. The He at the 2nd position and the He at the final position form a kind of breath pattern inside the name itself. Many scholars of Hebrew phonology have noted that the tetragrammaton, pronounced as written, produces something indistinguishable from the sound of human breathing. Inhale and exhale, rendered as sacred text. The Vav is the sixth letter. Its ancient form was a hook or a nail, but more precisely, in its grammatical function, it is a conjunction, a connector. The Vav in Hebrew does something almost no single letter in any other alphabet does. It can transform the tense of a verb. It can make past become future and future become past. Grammarians call this the Vav consecutive, and its presence in the tetragrammaton has led several generations of Hebrew linguists, including Wilhelm Gesenius in the 19th century and Frank Moore Cross in the 20th, to connect the name directly to the Hebrew verb hayah, to be. Not to be as in existence, as a static state. Hayah in Hebrew is not the Greek verb to be, which implies essence, unchanging identity, philosophical being. Hayah is active. It is being that happens, that emerges, that causes other things to come into being alongside it. It is the verb used when the text says, "Let there be light." Not the announcement of a concept, but the act of bringing something from non-existence into reality.
The tetragrammaton, from this angle, is not a name that means the one who is. It is a name that means the one who is always in the act of causing to exist, the one whose very being is generative, not a lord who rules from a throne, a source that is perpetually actively breathing reality into existence, including the existence of the one calling out to it. Does that shift something in how you understand what you're doing when you speak to this name? Now, anchor this in text, because etymology without context is guesswork. The moment the tetragrammaton is first spoken aloud in the Hebrew scriptures, not just written, but deliberately, dramatically spoken by God about himself to a human being, is Exodus chapter 3. Moses is standing at a burning bush. He asks the question that no one had apparently dared to ask in recorded scripture before him. What is your name? What do I call you when I go back to the people who need to know who sent me? The answer in Hebrew is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. 3 words that the King James Bible, following the Latin Vulgate, translated as I am that I am. A phrase that sounds like a philosophical absolute, like God announcing his own ontological sovereignty. But the verb Ehyeh is hayah in the first person imperfect. The imperfect tense in Hebrew does not describe a completed action. It describes an ongoing, unfinished, continuously active process. A more structurally accurate translation would be something like, I am the one who will always be causing things to come into being. I am the one who is perpetually in the act of becoming present to you. I will be what the situation requires me to be when it requires me to be it. This is not the self-announcement of a monarch. This is the self-disclosure of a being whose nature is essentially relational, essentially responsive, essentially alive in the direction of the ones it is speaking to. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, whose 1923 work I and Thou changed how 20th century theology understood relational presence, spent years arguing that the tetragrammaton was not a name in any ordinary sense, but a word pointing to the quality of presence that makes genuine encounter possible. Buber was drawing on something that Second Temple Jewish literature had been exploring for centuries before him. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain a document called the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. 11 copies of it were found, which signals how central it was to the community at Qumran. This text describes angelic liturgies in which the tetragrammaton functions not as an address, but as a kind of frequency, a resonance that the worshiping community attempts to attune itself to. The angels in these songs are not bowing before a title. They are, in the language of the scroll, participating in the divine being.
drawn into the ongoing creative act of the one whose name is the breath of becoming. The Qumran community was not a fringe sect practicing exotic mysticism. They were a community of educated, scripturally serious Jews who believed they were recovering an original understanding that the temple establishment in Jerusalem had domesticated into something manageable and institutional.
Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher who was a contemporary of Jesus and who wrote extensively about the Hebrew scriptures in Greek for a Hellenistic audience, made an argument about the Tetragrammaton that mainstream Christian theology has largely set aside. In his work on the life of Moses, Philo argues that when God says Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh at the burning bush, the revelation is specifically that God has no name in the ordinary sense, because a name implies a bounded, definable thing, and the one speaking to Moses is the ground of all definition, the condition for all existence, the source from which all naming is possible. To call this being Lord, a relational title that implies a master-servant structure, is not wrong, but it captures the outer edge of the reality while leaving the interior completely untouched. Josephus, writing in the decades after the temple's destruction in 70 CE, mentions in his Jewish Antiquities that the pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton had been formally withheld from public worship during the Second Temple period, a development he traces to the high priesthood during the Hasmonean era. His account suggests this was not purely a reverence practice, but a consolidation of priestly authority. If only the high priest could pronounce the name, and only once a year on Yom Kippur in the inner sanctum of the temple, then access to the actual quality of divine presence described by the name was mediated entirely through institutional channels. The people had Lord. The institution had the name. The archaeology of synagogue inscriptions from the first 2 centuries CE shows something striking. In diaspora communities, Jewish communities living outside of Judea, in Rome, in Alexandria, in Antioch, the Tetragrammaton continued to appear in scrolls and in certain ritual objects in its full 4-letter form, long after its public pronunciation had been suppressed in Jerusalem. There is an ossuary inscription from a Jewish burial cave near Jericho dated to the 1st century CE that contains the name Yehoshua, which is the full form of the name we transliterate as Jesus, alongside the Tetragrammaton in a formula that reads, in translation, something close to "the Lord of becoming is salvation." The name of Jesus, Yehoshua in Hebrew, contains the Tetragrammaton as its root. The name of the one that Christianity declares to be the fullest revelation of God carries inside it the same 4-letter description of generative, relational, breathing presence. This was not lost on the early Jewish followers of Jesus. It was for them part of the point. Now bring this forward, because none of this is merely academic. There is a documented and growing phenomenon in contemporary faith communities that psychologists and sociologists of religion have begun calling God image disorder, a technical term for the measurable gap between what a person cognitively believes about God and how they emotionally experience God in actual daily life. Research from the Baylor Religion Survey, published across multiple waves from 2005 to 2021, found that a significant portion of American Christians who describe themselves as regularly practicing hold what researchers categorized as an authoritarian God image, a perception of God as distant, punitive, and primarily concerned with monitoring behavior. This group showed statistically higher rates of chronic anxiety, lower self-reported sense of meaning, and paradoxically, lower capacity for ethical behavior toward others than groups who held what the survey called an engaged God image. The data is not marginal. It is consistent across demographic groups, geographic regions, and denominational affiliations. The authoritarian God image is not random. It has a source.
It is the natural psychological consequence of worshiping a title rather than a name. When the God you address is Lord, defined by hierarchy, authority, and the power differential between ruler and subject, the posture your nervous system adopts in prayer is the posture of a subject before a monarch, vigilant, performing, calculating whether the request is appropriate, whether the devotion has been sufficient, whether the relationship has enough credit in it to survive one more petition. That posture, held over years, produces exactly the anxiety profile the Baylor surveys documented.
The Tetragrammaton does not describe that God. It describes a being whose nature is to be actively present to the one who calls, whose name is the sound of breathing, whose self-disclosure at the burning bush was not "I am the sovereign," but "I will always be becoming present to you in exactly the way the moment requires." That is not a God you perform for. That is a God you breathe with. The letter substitution that happened in the Second Temple period, Lord for the Tetragrammaton, was not a conspiracy. It was a well-intentioned act of reverence that gradually became an act of institutional management and then became invisible infrastructure. The people who attend churches built with that word carved over the door are not wrong to be there, but they deserve to know that the sign over the door is pointing towards something their tradition decided at some point to make harder to reach. The burning bush was not a display of power. It was a bush that burned without being consumed, an image of a presence that is fully, continuously active without destroying what it touches. The first thing that presence said before it gave Moses a mission was, "Take off your shoes, because the ground where you are standing is holy, not because you have prepared it, not because you have earned the designation, but because the one whose name is becoming presence is here. And that makes the ground beneath your feet different from what it was a moment ago." That is the name above the door of your prayer, not a title that governs you from a distance, a name that transforms the ground under your feet by the fact of its proximity. Tell me in the comments, when you pray, which image forms in your mind automatically? Is it a throne room? A judge's bench? Something else entirely? I want to know what image you inherited, because naming the image is the first step toward choosing whether to keep it. In the next video, we are going inside another word, one that appears in the Lord's Prayer, in the line that Christians have recited for 2,000 years without realizing it contains a social and economic concept from first century Galilee that, when you understand it, makes the entire prayer politically explosive. Stay close, because once you hear what that word actually meant to the people standing in the crowd when Jesus first said it, you will never recite it on autopilot again.